when I was preparing for this interview, I saw a note that said you were first elected to the House in 1989 special election, but that you took the oath of office in the Senate chambers because the House was being renovated at that point. Do you remember that?
Oh,
is
yes,
that true?
absolutely.
That's great.
Yes, and of course, because I was a class of one, I could invite as many people as I wanted, so I think we filled the chamber. We just had a ton of people.
Yeah. And did you think that you'd be here 30 years later?
No, never. And I learned from John Marty that the average for legislators is 6 years. I think people think that we're like Washington and people stay a long time, and they really don't. In fact, this year, of that newly elected class, 2 of them are, is it 2 or 3, are not going to run even for a second time. They get here, and it is not at all what they thought. One of them, that first day when you know what happens, they start playing games, and the families were here and they wanted to have a reception, but we were playing games on the floor. And one of the first termers said, "This is not a good use of my time." I thought, okay, she's not running again, and she isn't.
How have things changed over your time at the legislature?
Well, I think the games get worse, and so that means the dysfunction is worse. This year, for example, I can't even remember, somebody totaled how many amendments there were. There had never, it broke all records in terms of the number of amendments that the minority offered to the funding bills. And so when people ask me about my job, they usually say something about, is it fun or something like that. That's the last word I would use. And I often say, this job is a little like you go into work every day to bang your head against the wall. But when everything goes right, you can do a huge amount of good. And the big things take a long time, and the point is you don't give up. So I was the author of both the Blue Line and the Green Line in light rail. I worked on the Green Line for 10 years, I think. It was vetoed a couple of times. The Bell Museum, I worked on that for 10 years. But when it's done, we have a state-of-the-art natural history museum for this state.
And tell us a little bit about your district and the people you represent. What are some of the issues that are important to them?
So I represent parts of a couple of neighborhoods in St. Paul, St. Anthony Park and Como Park, and then 3 suburban cities, Falcon Heights, Lauderdale, and most of Roseville. So if you've been to the state fair, you've been to my district. And it really is, there was a time, I think, where we saw more divide between city and suburb, but I would say the issues in Roseville and Falcon Heights and Lauderdale are pretty much what they are in the other 2 neighborhoods in St. Paul that I represent. The Roseville School District struggles with its budget just as the St. Paul School District does. Those are the 2 school districts I represent. They all worry about property taxes. You know, as we underfund at the state level, that's the only source that they have, and so everybody is very conscious of the issue of property taxes.
I wanted to ask you, you're the chair of the House Housing, Finance, and Policy Division.
Correct.
And back during session before, you heard from people that came in and maybe even constituents about a housing crisis here in the state. How bad is it? Can you talk about the housing crisis?
It is getting worse. And the 2 fires in Minneapolis have just added to that. The Drake Hotel, I think there were 250 people living in those 2 buildings, and that means 250 who are now looking for another place. And we already were struggling. And this is an issue that's all over the state. I can remember last year, Dean Erdahl, who's from Greater Minnesota, saying his biggest priorities were housing and childcare. I'm thinking, wow.
In Greater Minnesota.
Yeah. Yes, and they're ours too. And so housing has become a bipartisan issue. All the bills that I had this legislative session passed with a strong bipartisan vote, and that vote just got stronger and stronger. And everybody knows the need. So for example, during the regular session, I passed a bill for $120 million of housing infrastructure bonds, and it passed with, I think, 100 votes out of 134. Subsequently, that wasn't passed in the Senate, and so in the special session, the leaders determined that we would do half of that. So in the special session, I again passed a bill, $60 million, and that passed, I think, with 114 votes, so strong bipartisan support for housing. Everybody understands it's a pressing need. Nothing else in life goes well if you don't have a safe place to sleep.
Yeah, 60
So
million.
you do that first, and then you can put all the other pieces together.
I wanted to ask you about that 60 million. How much of a dent, or how much is that going to help this crisis?
Well, the good thing is it leverages lots of private money. So the housing infrastructure bonds, that's a new tool that we had, I think maybe it was 2012 or 2013, that the Department of Minnesota Housing said, if we could, before that we just did general obligation bonding for public housing. And so with this new tool, we can partner with nonprofits. Lutheran Social Service, Catholic Charities, Common Bond, Beacon, Aon. They leverage, they raise a lot of private money. I think that there was I've got to check to update this, but I think the number was for every dollar of state money, we have $3 of private money. Beacon is a nonprofit that organizes the faith community. They have 100 faith communities around the state. I think mostly it's the metro area. And they do very creative problem solving. For example, one of the issues that we have is when someone is incarcerated, when they return to society, when landlords have plenty of people who want to rent, they can be selective, and it's hard for someone who has a criminal record to find a safe place to live. So Beacon built a place just for them in Minneapolis. And to further help them as they reunite with families, there's a playground and playroom and a family suite so that they can begin that reintegration with family. And Beacon provides those supportive services around that. What we've discovered is the best model is something called permanent supportive housing, where you put the services, for example, if there is a mental illness or addiction, or in the case of children, after school, childcare, if you can put the services right there, you can bring lives to a better place. And that's the goal, to bring a life to a better place.
You've chaired the Capital Investment Committee in the past, and as you well know, even-numbered years, it's going to focus on bonding here at the legislature. Governor Walz has said there's been more than $5 billion in requests this session.
Yes.
What's a realistic number Minnesotans can expect?
And frankly, that's not unusual. Usually every cycle there are between $4 and $5 billion of requests for a bill that's going to be closer to $1 billion. Realistically, we have guidelines that we follow very carefully, so we don't borrow without limit. Those guidelines are suggested to us by MMB and the governor. And we always stay within them, so it's been responsible. But that number, the governor will argue that we could go higher than $1 billion, but when we've got divided legislature as we do, that number just is intimidating to some. And so I'm guessing it would be closer to $1 billion. And the reason that that we have so many needs this year is we didn't get the job done last year. We had that small bonding bill at the start, which was just kind of a fix from the previous year, but we didn't do the aggressive work, and so the needs are great. And where we feel that, we certainly feel it in housing, but so does higher education, and their asset preservation needs just get greater and greater. Asset preservation for all public infrastructure, I think, is feeling some of the strain when we don't get that work done.